Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Imaginary Movie Podcast, a podcast where you have to obey the key rules of the Slasher podcast, which is that you absolutely must have lots and lots of sexy time when there's a killer on the loose. Definitely go out in the dark all the time, and definitely arrange for your unreliable female friends to not have any fixed plans so that you know where people are and who's been murdered. Absolutely don't do that.
Okay, there we go. That's
My
the
name's
rules.
David, and in 20 minutes I will be revealed as one of the killers.
You will indeed. My other tip for this is always walk slowly everywhere, just because it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter basically. Why run? Because they're going to chase up. They're going to catch you anyway. So you may as well save your own breath, so that you can eventually fight off a inhumanly strong person. That is. Dave, we're watching horror movies. I'm not in a happy place. I don't like horror films, but it's Halloween, and so we are obliged, because of the way that this podcast has been constructed, to record a horror movie episode for this Halloween night. What did we do, Dave?
Did we do Scream last year?
Then we did Scream. We've done quite a few, haven't we, of these type of movies. But
I've certainly watched a lot of slasher movies.
This is my point. You are the Halloween slasher movie guy. These are movies that are outside of my comfort zone.
October 2023.
Yes.
I never used to like horror movies or slasher movies either. I was a bit of a scaredy kid, so I just wasn't a fan of being scared. But there's something that,
Boo!
like any genre, the more you watch it, I think the more you pick up on the genre-specific ways in which the film is constructed, and appreciate it more and more. Obviously, the absolute MVP of this for me is Scream. All of the Scream films, all of which are pretty good, some of which are excellent.
God, stop talking about the Scream movies. I can't have one conversation without you bringing up the bloody goddamn Scream movies.
You're right. You're right, Sam. Let me talk about something else. Let's talk about Alfred Hitchcock. So, the slasher movie, I think, is a really early example. 1978 is kind of like, this is the movie that's credited with kind of kickstarting the. I will say, and there's a caveat here, but the prestige slasher movie, I think.
Yes.
Because, slasher movies are B movies, let's get a bunch of sexy teenagers, acting skills not required, and then we'll just murder them in states of undress throughout the movie. It'll be great, it'll make loads of money. And that has generally been a pretty solid rule in Hollywood.
Yeah. And you mentioned Hitchcock because presumably you're talking about Psycho, which is to me that is like the prototypical slasher movie,
isn't it? Yeah.
Well, but it's also, I think, because I think it's slightly before what you think of now, which is like a bunch of teenagers, chasing them around a mall or an industrial site or something, and there we go, you've got your movie. Whereas Psycho was something new. It was very, very violent for the time, but it also had the Hitchcock kind of layered and quite good filmmaking. And I think probably, hey, we're doing Halloween, by the way, and I think probably Halloween for me is much more in that, it is that kind of crossover point between your like Psycho-y Hitchcock doing a 60s movie into something that is cheap and cheerful, but still has a level of artistry, which, in my view, has completely been lost in the horror movie, just gorescape, which is just awful. The Saw movies, I can't be doing any of that.
We'll circle back to that. I agree. I think this is it's a really good movie. I think there's so much in this movie that obviously, like you said, takes a lot of it directly from films like Psycho, like The Thing, previous sort of like thrillers maybe, rather than slasher movies.
Yeah.
And then coalesces it into kind of like we've talked before about how the late 70s and the early 80s are kind of the first time that we're making loads of movies for teenagers. Movies weren't really for teenagers. When Psycho came out in 1960, like, movies weren't for teenagers. Movies were starring 35-year-old people for 35-year-old people. Like, that was, kind of the way that existed. And so this movie, a movie about a bunch of teenagers, basically, and then this one, psycho killer, like, it's kind of a cool thing, and it's maybe a different way to explore that. You said cheap. This movie was incredibly cheap. I think it cost about $300,000 to make. Which is not a lot of money.
And do you know how much it made?
Yes, because I'm looking at it right now. But you can tell, for the magic of podcasting, you can tell me now, and I'll act shocked.
$70 million.
Oh my God! Finish.
in 1978 as well. I mean, it's a staggering amount of money, and I think it's, we've watched many movies like this where it comes out of nowhere, and people weren't expecting for this movie to have the impact that it did, and yet I think this is a film that isn't just flash of the pan. This is a film that is creative and interesting and tries new stuff, quite literally, in terms of some of the technology they use, but also I think is as we've already set out, it's setting up so much of what the modern horror movie is. And so you can't really understand horror movies, I think, without watching a movie, without watching Halloween. But don't watch any of the others. Don't even look at them. Don't look them in the eye, because I guarantee you that all of them are shit. All of them. I haven't seen them, and I don't want to see them.
I will say, I've got kind of like a... We're no longer in our 20s. Shocker for anyone who's watching this on YouTube. We're getting older. I have a much more, like, chilled out... In my 20s, I was full of piss and vinegar, and now it's mostly just piss. Full of piss and vineger, and like, oh god, all these franchises, and they just keep making soulless remakes, and they keep, oh my god, sequels and sequels and sequels. Oh, what a waste of our time, and what a waste of their money, and why do they keep making these, and blah 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 blah. And hours of drunken ranting about how we should stop making sequels. Like, it's terrible, it's derivative, and do you know what? Fine, if you want to make 13 Halloween movies and people are enjoying them, great, fantastic. Am I going to watch them? Probably not, unless I'm contractually compelled to because of the podcast. But it's fine, isn't it? Like, I thought this because I recently watched the Scream franchise, and that was another one where, like, the first two are pretty good, the third one's really not as good, and then I was like, oh, and they made another 3 or 4, 3. But then I watched them and I was like, actually, if you go into it with a viewpoint of, like, I like the universe, I'm happy to just watch basically the same film again with different faces, that's great. There's some, it may not be particularly artistically distinct or valuable, and potentially, like we always say, maybe you could have taken that money and given it to, I don't know, a first-time female director with an original idea, or maybe even someone who's a minority with an original idea. But that's not the way that Hollywood works.
That's crazy, Dave. Please don't say anything else that's crazy like that. No, I think I get what you're saying. And there is the curmudgeon old man who's like, "Oh, kids these days, blah blah." But at the same time, I think we can also be critical of the fact that they will just shit out any of these movies because the name is almost guaranteed to make them money. I mean, when you've got goddamn Rob Zombie directing 2 of these, and they it just looks absolute. It just looks. It's not at the same caliber, and I think this is the problem I've got with a lot of the big franchises, and Scream is definitely one of them. Is that you've got this great idea that's lots of creative people have done lots of interesting stuff, and then not that the people who are making the sequels aren't creative, but they're not invested in creating a something that is unique and interesting, that or even actually recreates the same film in a new way. Like, so I think it's the fact that they're just churning these out because the name gets the bums on seats in
yeah, absolutely, Sam. And the sheer capitalistic nature of that does offend me deeply. But what I would say is maybe not as personally affronted by the existence of franchises as I was.
Oh, I'm personally affronted. How could they
No.
do this to me? How could they do this to me?
And do you know
Terrible.
what it is, Sam? Do you know what it is? It's just generally, just go along to get along in a certain respect. And I know that doesn't make for interesting critical analysis. So we will jump into maybe talking about some more of the specific things about this film.
Yeah, I don't. This is too light.
And I will say that I think slashers are maybe the most guilty of all genres of having just a million. Every one of these franchises has a million entries. I think there's 13 Halloween movies. I think there are over 10 Nightmare on Elm Street movies. There are 6 Scream movies.
Yeah.
They seem to remake Last House on the Left or Cabin in the Woods every 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
There are over 10 Saw films, I think.
There is one coming. Yeah, Saw 10 was 2 years ago. Sorry, last year, and then Untitled Saw 11 comes out in 2025.
Yeah. So whereas name another genre with franchises that big, apart from Marvel, which is
Marvel,
or James
Star
Bond.
Wars,
James Bond has got more films than that. Fast and Furious, there's more than 10 of them.
Well, I think, but the point is,
aside from that, these are all different genres, genres. Aside from that, I think but I think a lot of that is because slashers are so cheap to make.
It's the cheapness of it, isn't it? It's the cheapness, and that's reflected, I think, in the budget of this movie in $300,000. But let's get into this, and let's start with that the first part of Halloween, because as much as this is a cheap movie and you can see it, you can see the wires quite literally in some cases. You can see, I think, the overall lack of resource that they've got to invest in the sets. And so we're shooting in neighborhoods, and it's nice and easy and it's simple, and it's in California or wherever else because it doesn't rain very much. So there's all this stuff here that's easy to manage. And yet the opening couple of minutes of this film are like really, really incredible. Like, I love this Steadicam. Now, I was looking it up. I think we're 2 or 3 years into the Steadicam handheld camera that remains relatively level, and they're just single shot walking around this house with the mask on, and we're seeing
this child murder a bunch of people. It's great.
It's fantastic.
You can see why this movie was such a revelation in 1978. We've done some 70s movies recently, and this is just so at odds with everything else that's on the screen right now. Even in a time period where the Star Wars came out the year before this.
Exactly. What a end of the decade it must have been for movie goers.
If it wasn't for all the cigarette smoke and all the cancer causing stuff in the air and on the plates and literally
and the
everywhere,
lead.
And
all the lead.
The 1970s would be a really cool decade to go back to. And obviously we're the most boring people in the world, but wouldn't it be cool to have a time machine and just go back to the premiere of films? In the cinema?
So you've harnessed time travel, and what we're going to be using it for, sir, is going back in time to see Star Wars in 1977 opening weekend.
And Alien. And
oh my goodness.
Psycho in 1960.
Completely legitimate use of this.
I'm sorry,
grade.
I just think you'd Gone with the Wind for the 15 years that was in the cinema. That's a pretty wide one, not a lot of.
But it must have been. So you're sitting down in the cinema and you see this opening
through the haze of cigarette smoke.
Through the haze of cigarette smoke and the lead paint they've added to popcorn. You see this
crunch.
shot, and you go up the stairs and it's just brilliant. It's technically brilliant, and I think it really, for me, I'd never seen this movie before, and I was kind of expecting it to be very rough and ready, and then to see something that you probably wouldn't expect to see in a movie like this from the 70s. It was a real breath of fresh air, and I have to say I was slightly disarmed in my cynicism, in my bloody 70s movies.
I think because this is a slasher film that doesn't suffer from 40 years of slasher films.
It
doesn't have the weight
this.
of the baggage of all. Do you know what I mean? I think Scream, not to keep talking about Scream is a wonderful, wonderful movie because it's kind of it's having a lot of fun with the stuff that made slasher films quite like
It's postmodern, isn't it?
notoriously silly because of all the the excessive gore, because you've got to be gorier with every given film, and you've got to shock audiences, and you've got to be pulling intestines out and making balloon animals out of them, because that's the only thing the audience hasn't seen before. And at a certain point it just becomes the Saw franchise, which is literally just murder pornography. This isn't about the Saw franchise, but whereas this, I think, is actually quite clever, engaging, really tight filmmaking with a really relatively down to earth story about a semi supernaturally strong, an escaped mental patient comes and murders a load of people. That's it. That's the movie.
Yeah. Small town America, idyllic, middle class, people are happy, they've got picket fences, and you kind of break through that a little bit, don't you, with some of the stuff that's going on, but it's very much focused, and I really love the setting of this movie. I love the overall vibe that we're presented with.
This is absolute peak Anytime America, isn't it? This is it's really 1950s, 1970s America.
Yeah. From everything that the cars that they're driving to the clothes that especially the girls are wearing, some of these, some of the costume work I think is fantastic in giving us the shortcuts to.
I do wonder how much of that is just this is what teenagers were wearing in 1978.
All of our teachers were wearing these clothes.
Have you seen old footage or pictures of school children, teenagers? And you look at the 1970s ones, and they all look 45 years old, and it's because
of
they're
all the
dressing
lead
like 45-year-olds.
in the breakfast cereal.
No,
yes.
It's because they're dressing like 45-year-olds, Sam.
Yeah.
It's the lead paint chips used to colour the dresses.
See, you're 100% right? And this is exactly what I was thinking. And then the movie did something interesting, because in terms of the clothing is one point, but let's just actually go to the characters that we see, because we've got, I think, a really interesting character in Jamie Lee Curtis, who is kind of the goody two shoes, isn't she? She's kind of, and she, for the most part, if you think about it, through the clothes that she wears, she's kind of quite prim and proper throughout the whole movie, and doesn't really go outside of that. You compare that to I haven't got the characters up here. The black-haired girl who's babysitting
Annie.
Yeah, sure. You compare it to her.
Annie and Lindsay, I think, are the friends. I could be wrong there.
Yes, the one who spills stuff on her clothes, and so decides to take in someone else's house, decides to take off her clothes and wash them in the wash machine. That's an interesting choice you've made there. But what it does, it represents...
Sorry, Annie and Linda. I think it was Annie that we're talking about there.
Yeah, I think it's Annie. So what it represents, the clothes represent, I think, how this movie is almost like treating its characters. And I was 100% thinking, this is just what old people wear now. But at the same time, the movie was kind of self-aware enough to put them in quite prim and proper, and then almost we go to the classic horror movie thing, which is that if you're having sex in a horror movie, you're gonna die. And the
it's
movie,
all here, isn't it? There's that.
The movie goes for it.
There's that morality, isn't there? That if you're a teenager and you're having sex, you're gonna die. And
she takes her clothes off. She deserves to die.
The final girl. You've got Jamie Lee Curtis as the final girl in this movie.
Yeah.
She's virtuous. She's not shagging a boyfriend, and therefore she gets to live.
She's looking after
all
the
these
kids.
things. Literally, just watch Scream, and in Scream they kind of explain all of the things that this movie set up as part of their plot.
Yeah. But what I want to ask you, and what I'm interested in, is whether or not is this the first instance of this? I mean, it can't be. It can't be in the sense of obviously sexual chastity being morally virtuous. But what it might be is the first, at least mainstream instance of in a slasher horror movie, sex perhaps being used as a yardstick of whether or not this person's gonna die, and the clothes and the way they're acting is all part of that, to the point where we've got Annie, with a in her pants. Even the sister at the start, we get to see her naked, bizarrely for no reason, and it's like almost like a signal to say she's dead. Do you know what I mean? And that continues, as you say, all the way through horror movies. There's no people of color in this movie, as far as I could remember. So that one, we're not going to get that trope today. But I do think like we're setting up a lot of the tropes, and that's cool. That's cool to see this enacted. If that makes sense.
Definitely. It's also kind of cool to see like a fairly, aside from the murder, which is obviously comes later in the movie. I think this is a really cool, like, just chilled out depiction of teenagers. You know, they're not doing heroin and beating people up and, do you know what I mean? Doing like
not like when we were kids,
like
Dave.
This isn't a 1960s view of what teenagers are like. I think this is a much more realistic kind of like depiction of how teenagers are and how they act around each other. And it's quite quaint. It's a small town. They're all babysitting, you know. But there's a rhythm to the characterization that we see on the screen, kind of undercut by the music and the Dr. Loomis, who's a weird character. And Michael Myers is the bad guy in this one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Although it's kind of like neither here nor there, his actual name. But it's kind of like it's a really almost Pleasantville of like having this really normal Stepford Wivesy kind of like nice 1970s, 1950s kind of like nice placid facade of just congeniality. And then undercut with, you know, there's this murderer on the loose, which kind of, for the first maybe half of the movie, feels very much like it's taking place in its own self-contained, not unconnected universe, in a good way, I think.
Yeah, I think, there's let's get into the
sidebar. Dr. Loomis, let's get into Dr. Loomis.
Yeah, right. Let's get into that.
So, main bar, no sidebar. I love the line from Dr. Loomis where he's like, and I love this saying in the script, so this kid has been in this mental asylum since he was 6, and he steals a car and runs away, and the doctor's like, how does he know how to drive? Very fair question. Very fair question, Dr. Loomis.
I think there's a filmmaking term to that, which is we're going to hang a lantern on it, which is we're going to make it so we're going to point out the plot hole in our movie just so you don't, audience member. So shut up, all right? We're going to say it first. This whole thing, this whole Dr. Loomis, Donald Pleasance plot when he drives to the mental asylum and he's getting attacked. They're getting attacked by the escaped patients who are kind of acting a little bit like sheep. They're just kind of standing around fields in white gowns. Like the whole thing like is verging on a weird 1930s, you know, driving through the dark night with the rain kind of vibe that you might get in a
it's
noir
a very
movie.
Tropey depiction of mental asylums, which is like even that is a term that we've maybe moved on from.
We don't, but not even that necessarily, but just the way, just the whole thing, they're driving through the night, and you know, like it's just a weird noir vibe to this that I think doesn't quite match maybe with the horror movie in a small town that they're also inventing, I guess, or at least popularizing in this movie. And then as he comes in as Donald Pleasance, he's just this mad anchor that's just sat around. He's literally just sat around for most of the movie, just
and
sat
he's like
waiting.
It's a really weird situation where
being
it's
dramatic.
not like, something weird's going on. It's not an X-Files episode where, you know, you've got Scully and Mulder.
Mulder and Scully.
Anyway, I should know this. I've watched a lot of X-Files.
Nerd.
You've got Mulder and Scully trying to like solve the mystery in the background of this movie. This isn't Pretty Woman, where you've got Hank Azaria trying to solve this prostitute murder in the background of this charming movie about the prostitute. Anyway, sorry, refer back to our Pretty Woman episode.
Yes.
You haven't got that.
He's
kind of like Dr.
He's
Loomis
gonna kill
is
everyone.
like Dr. Loomis feels like he is a rogue psychiatrist who has a gun and wants to put this mentally ill man down. That is his MO in this movie is, I want to put a bullet in this man because he's going to kill again. I want to find him and help him. I want to kill him. It's a
Yeah.
really odd, aggressive, kind of like weird vibe to it, I think.
But he's also quite impotent, isn't he? Because he clearly can't do anything, and you get the classic police chief who is so uninterested, and I would be as well. To be fair, on this occasion, I'd be like, "Fucking it, this guy, who are you? Do you have a badge? Do you have any authority here? Have you just?"
Sam, this
have you
was the
just
1970s, and Dr. Loomis is a white man, and therefore he
Yeah.
can walk into any police department in the country and do whatever he likes.
and demand that a police officer just hangs around a house. I mean, the police chief is, or at least I'm not sure if it's the chief, but the police officer is fairly uninterested in the whole thing, and that's quite fun as well. But there's a frustration to him that I think maybe the movie's trying to channel in terms of how the audience might feel of like, somebody do something, like he's slowly getting away. It's like there's always a sense of that in these horror movies that I think is there to kind of make the audience feel what the characters are feeling, and that's quite.
But this is
quite
quite
fun.
segmented in a way, I think. We get
It feels like
quite
a
lot of
separate movie,
quite,
doesn't it?
quite a lot of build up, and we get sort of like the creepy, like Jamie Lee Curtis is being followed around. It's a bit unnerving, and then compare it to a movie like, I don't know if you've seen I Know What You Did Last Summer,
I think I have actually. Yes,
which I think is maybe the movie that gives slasher movies like the worst reputation. Actually, I think it's a lot of fun, but it's not a good movie. But in that movie, people start getting killed after like 10 minutes, and it's like, well, we've got like 100 more minutes, and how are we going to keep this tension up? How are we going to ramp this up? And whereas I think this movie makes the smart decision in this script is to kind of have all of that happen at the end. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think anyone gets killed until.
It's quite a long time, and I have to
really
say
late. Not that it's a long movie, I should say. It's like 89,
it's not a long
90
movie,
minutes.
but I do think there was a just a tiny little bit of a padded fat middle of this movie where I think we could maybe get to the money a little bit quicker, especially when we're watching again Donald Pleasance like running around basically just accosting people and saying, "Have you seen Michael Myers?" Blah. Like, all right, mate. Sorry, no, not today. Thanks. There's a bit of that where I'm like, we could maybe get to the kill, but when we kind of move into the last act, which I think is probably where most of the action happens, isn't it? In terms of the violence and the killing, that's when I think it really does pick up a pace. But I think you're right to say that, yeah, a lot of the more modern movies aren't giving the audience enough credit, or more realistically, are accurately reflecting the fact that none of them will watch a movie like this for 20 minutes without seeing some kind of blood and guts.
Yeah,
So,
I think, like you said, a part of that is obviously there's the movie-going audience that like goes to see the Saw movies, and I'm as guilty of that. I've seen a Saw movie in the cinema. God help me. And I remember nothing about it. This is a little sidebar story. This is when we were at university, 50 million years ago in the Heterozoic. I was going to say something clever and paleontological, but I couldn't. Think of the word 'cause I'm
Mesozoic era.
Mesozoic era. That would have been really funny if that's what I'd said. Can we edit that?
You blew it.
Back in the Mesozoic era, we actually wanted to go and see The Dark Knight, but it was sold out. So
your runner-up prize was the Saw movie.
Well, that's what else was on. They were like, "Oh, they're sold out, I'm afraid." But the Saw's playing it in 20 minutes, and there's a Weatherspoons next door. So we were like, "Well, let's go and get a beer and then go and watch the Saw movie." Not the worst time I've ever had. Very, very bad movie. But that's a movie which you go to watch the kills. Whereas I think this is a movie. Number one, I think it's doing something so distinct from the movies that came before it, or maybe even just more successfully than the movies that came before it, because there's that old rule, isn't there, that the movie you think kind of like started a trend isn't the movie that originated it, it's just the movie that was successful in doing that.
Yes.
Yes. I bet if we dipped into the late 70s kind of like slasher horror movie B-movie things, we'd probably find like other examples of more or less this exact script, probably, because that's just the way that the industry works. But you look at this, and it's...
But not made, I think, with the same clarity and precision and all
Absolutely.
the other stuff.
And that's why
you
this
know.
is the successful example and the one that's kind of like taught in film school, when you're learning about this genre and stuff like that. But I think it's also kind of maybe it's not really about the murders in this movie, which are graphic and are shocking, but they're not like on the Saw level of, spending 20 minutes explaining to us how we're going to peel this guy's eyeball while it's somehow still in his head, and that's somehow a movie.
Yes.
It's more like the murders are shocking and scary, but they kind of exist to ramp up the tension for the final kind of like fight/chase with Jamie Lee Curtis, and to establish the idea of the final girl, I would be interested to look at like how common was that as a trope in movies before this movie, and the fact that also there's no mystery about who's doing this. Like I kind of love that about this movie, is that at no point are we like, oh my god, who's committing all these murders? Oh, it's this little boy. No, we know that from the very start. It's very clear. This boy commits all these murders. We see it. We flash forward. He's escaped from mental prison, and we think he's going to murder a load more people, and then he does. There couldn't be less mystery in this movie. In a perfect way.
Because
but isn't that
that's
interesting? Isn't that interesting?
not,
because
yeah. Because
like
that's
the
not the film they
Saw
wanted to
movies,
make.
the Scream movies, kind of like they do have that element of like, who's the killer?
Yeah.
All of them. Whereas this is kind of like, we know who the killer is, we know what he's going to do, and then he does it, and you are shocked, and it is tense, and so much of that is pinpoint filmmaking of having it be kind of like tense and creepy and just slightly unnerving throughout, but also quite charming and quite quaint and quite homey, and then also just a little bit like, oh, what's going on here? I'm just making noises now, but you know exactly what I mean.
I think you're completely right. Especially it goes to the point that I think this is something new, isn't it? This is something novel, and this is something that we hadn't seen, because probably if you're going to make the movie like this 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier, whatever else, it's going to be Psycho, which is much more of a mystery movie with one violent scene at the end, or midway through, because it's about, well, who is this? And then the reveal at the end, spoilers for a 1960s movie, is that the mother's been dead for years, and he's
1960, Sam, 64 years ago.
Yeah, so I think probably we've reached the statute of limitations that. But I think it's so indicative of just how fresh this is, and I think when you look at all the movies that come off after, who the bad guy is absolutely vital. Freddy Krueger, like the ghost face from Scream, like the fact that you get all of the mysteries gone, because actually what we want to see is who the bad guys are and how they're operating.
The movie's about the vibes, and that's a very 2020s term that I'm applying to this 1978 movie, but it kind of is the movie. Even if you look at mentioned Freddy Krueger, you look at Nightmare on Elm Street, which I also watched really recently, because again, I'm just suddenly in my mid-30s catching up with all these slasher movies from the last 45 years.
Yeah.
Even in that movie, the violence is quite spread through the whole movie. The first murder happens after like 15 minutes, and we get kind of like, one more every 20 minutes for the rest of the movie. In a way that it's kind of like meted out a lot more steadily. Same with the Scream franchise. Same with I Know What You Did Last Summer. Same with a lot of those Saw movies. And I think that's as the genre developed, and they kind of figured that that's going to be the lowest common denominator of audiences are here for the kills, so let's give them a little bit, and then a bit more, and then a bit more. Whereas I think this is like less well formed in that respect. I think it makes for a much stronger movie, but I think that potentially we are in as non-native slasher fans, I would maybe say, I think we may be in the minority there, where like this is really well regarded and revered for its place in the slasher pantheon, but potentially it kind of is on the slower, less intense end for a lot of hardcore fans.
Yes. Oh no, definitely.
Does that make sense? Have I just waffled and not said anything?
No, I get it, because
it's
no, because it's like if you could very easily be really, really into horror movies and never have seen this, because it's a movie from the late 70s, and that's no criticism necessarily. There's lots of movies I haven't seen. But I think probably it's exactly what we always talk about, is that if you go back in time and watch Citizen Kane, you know, in 1940, it's wow, this is like, I've never seen anything like this. And if you go and watch it now in the 2020s, you're kind of like, what's the deal? I don't get why this is such a big deal. It's because you'd never seen a shot
That's specifically not for me and you though, because I watched it and I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. Why haven't I seen this before?
But it's because all of the art.
Joe Public at the cinema. Let's put ourselves on a pedestal here and be elitist. Yes. Joe Public at the cinema, who knows nothing about movies, the swine.
It's not even that. It's that all of the characteristics that make something great, if they are good, then they get scooped up and they get used in every single movie. Panning shots, steady cams, you know, the use
Star
of
Wars is the example, isn't it? Like
it all gets taken, it all gets chewed up by the machine and spat out in every other movie that's ever made, because the original ideas are copied, and that's how art works, and that's absolutely fine. And so sometimes I think you might go back and look at it and say, I don't get what, I love horror movies, but this is just slow and boring. Like, I don't think that's the case here, but I can understand that perspective. Absolutely.
It's certainly not as shocking as potentially like later movies. Is it House of Wax with Paris Hilton in it? Sorry, this is a really deep cut. Another movie I've seen once. Didn't see that at the cinema. Where I think she's murdered like mid having sex. That maybe the standards of the movie moved on, where we get to see characters in this movie we don't see them have sex, but it's heavily implied, and
we get a good, again, the
yes,
blonde
it's
head girl.
Raunchy, but I think that the stepping up of that, like you said, it's kind of like, I think this movie is perfectly balanced in that respect, where it kind of like it implies a lot but doesn't actually show you it, because it doesn't. Number one, it doesn't need to necessarily, and number two, I think it just makes for a better movie where it's not like, and we're going to stop the movie for 5 minutes so we can have a sex scene, which certainly other movies in this genre are guilty of. But it's kind of that constant ramping up of what this movie starts, and then we've got to have like, so the teenagers have got to be even more sexy and even more sexually active and even more promiscuous and even more in a tent in the woods and Halloween where there's murderers around, like even more of that, because you kind of have to be bigger and better. It's the Michael Bay thing. It's 25 9/11s and then more,
faster
and
more intense. Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about Jamie Lee Curtis, because this is a really interesting career that kind of.
She has never looked more like Tony Curtis than in this movie.
Yes, I know, you nepo baby, Jamie Lee Curtis. We haven't forgotten. We haven't forgotten who your dad was. So she was in TV, and then this is her debut. It's a stunning performance, really, isn't it? It's a really, really, like, you can see why this movie had so much success, is because Jamie Lee Curtis embodies perfectly the kind of innocent teenager, not innocent necessarily, that's maybe not the right word, but she's just like a normal teenager. She's very normal. She's very kind of like focused on the type of things that teenagers are into. It's all quite, I think, sedate, her life, and she's babysitting and other stuff. And then we get the transformation at the end to the kind of being chased around. The Scream Queen, exactly. And the movies that she did after this were all horror movies as well. Most of them with John Carpenter.
She was kind of stuck in the horror genre for 4 or 5 years until Trading Places, I think.
Yes, Trading Places is the one where
she did A Fish Called Wanda, and then she did that film with Schwarzenegger, and they're kind of like
True Lies.
True Lies, and in my head, they're the big. You know, she's been acting throughout. Blue Steel, I don't know when that came out, but she's in a lot of these movies. But yeah, certainly initially she was kind of stuck in that, you know, you're the horror queen, you're the horror movie woman, you're going to be in horror movies, you're a hot commodity when someone's trying to murder you. And that's right. Violence against women. You are the woman for violence against women.
Well, that's a whole other subject, isn't it? That's maybe bigger than this episode of the podcast. But yes, there is definitely some tropey shit that is uncomfortable, and maybe we should all be a little bit more self-reflective about when it comes to horror movies. But
like
again,
you said, maybe this isn't the podcast.
I don't think we have time to get.
I don't think. No, also, Sam, I don't know if two men who, with a shaky like rhetorical knowledge of this subject, are the best people to kind of tackle that. I think we've
How
acknowledged it.
dare you
We've
suggest
acknowledged it,
that
Sam.
How dare you?
You're not
How
doing the
dare
hands, so it's not being sold at all.
You? What is that accidental Trump?
Yeah.
I could do the hands, and then it all comes together. I like the hands are important. It's all about the hands. So
You're going to be president any day now.
I know. Well, God, let's hope not. We are just days
Speaking
away.
of horror invading reality,
Jesus Christ. But yeah, but Jamie Lee Curtis, I think, is such an important part of this movie, and I think an actor that, you know, it's there's so many good performances there that I think
so many different performances. I think
it's
there's a real
varied.
range
You can
to Jamie Lee Curtis, and
yeah.
I kind of wish she got more chances to do. Things have changed a little, and maybe with the cachet from movies like this and Trading Places and Wonder, like she potentially could have just written her own ticket in a way that she couldn't in the late 80s and the early 90s in America. But yeah, I mean, she's still good. She was in Knives Out. She's very good in that. She's still acting. They're making another Freaky Friday, Sam, which is an interesting.
Obviously, they're making a remake of the remake of the remake, and it's going to be remakes all the way down. I think is the only thing that's.
Fuck you, you'll buy it. Not specifically you, but anyway, she's still acting, and that's great. That's my point here. We really love Jamie Lee Curtis. I think she's the patron saint of this podcast in a lot of ways.
We say that.
Refer to any of the horny conversations we've had about Jamie Lee Curtis on the podcast. Because have we done Trading Places? I think we have.
I believe we have as a Christmas
We've
movie.
definitely
Yes.
done Wonder, and Ross and I did True Lies, I think.
Yes, that is. Yeah.
So yeah, refer to all the horny conversations we've had about Jamie Lee Curtis. That's fine.
Yeah,
Let's undercut any of the things we just said in favour of. You know,
let's not focus on those specific aspects. Anyway, so Halloween.
I'm a white man, Sam. I will not be held accountable for things that I've said publicly in the past.
Okay, well, I could. There's certainly a view, and I think it's counter to this this feminist podcast, which it is, and so let's keep it in that vein. This is a really, really good movie. I think we've established it's one of those films that I think I would 100% come back to and watch, even as someone who's not really into the kind of slasher genre. But I think it really does underline to me the power of cinema to, number one, like set trends and really define what scary is, because a like almost superhuman, unstoppable force bad guy who walks slowly everywhere, you don't see his face, and he's relentless, remorseless, and like that is something that is lodged in all of our psyches, I think, because of this movie, because of movies that have come after this, and like just that in itself, the fact that Michael Myers is a character that sits, I think, even outside of this film and outside of the franchise, he sits as you can buy Michael Myers skins in Fortnite. So
it's certainly on the pantheon of horror, of
like Darth
horror
Vader,
franchises.
it's up there, isn't it?
It's kind of the iconic ones are Michael Myers, they are Freddy Krueger. I think potentially just because it's a more interesting character design, almost like it was designed to be a toy, and then Ghostface maybe, Jigsaw from the Saw films, like. They're all up there, I think, of more recognisable kind of.
Yeah, I think the first couple are definitely. I'm not sure about but yeah.
But even Freddy Krueger is like a significant deepening of this trope of Michael Myers is a
Pennywise maybe.
Pennywise, yeah. Michael Myers is a character who like murdered a load of people when he was a kid, and I'm sure they've retconned a lot of that and changed a lot of the details over the years. And he's scary, and he's got the mask on, and then Freddy Krueger's a child murdering paedophile who's burnt to death by a town and then haunts and murders teenagers in their dreams, ? Like, it's a much more muddy, convoluted, complex, overly horrible origin than Michael Myers, I think, which kind of maybe shows you the progression of the genre over. I mean, it was only 6 years later.
Yeah. Do you want to know
But
how many?
6 years, and they'd made something like 100 slasher movies, like theatrically released slasher movies in America in those 6 years, which is
Fuck
an insane
you.
number.
You'll buy it. Do you want to know how many canons, how many timelines there are for Michael Myers as a character? So it says
Well, I
here
know they reboot. I know they remade the first one.
we've
So
got the
this-
original timeline, which is
this
the
one.
one, and then we've got the Thorn timeline.
Is that the
Because
remake?
Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers in 1988, which picks up 10 years after the events of Halloween 2. Known as the Thorn timeline, Michael survived the explosion, leaving him in a coma. Blah, 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 who cares? Then we've got the H2O timeline, which is 20 years later.
I'm sorry, what does that mean?
It establishes a new timeline, ignoring the events of the previous 3 Thorn films. In this particular film, Michael had been missing since the hospital explosion 20 years ago. Laurie Strode has faked her death and gone into hiding in California. And on it goes. Madness. Oh, don't worry, there's another one. With the Rob Zombie 2007 rebooted remakes, the film establishes from the beginning that Michael and Laurie are siblings. What? Yep, that's right. Okay. And a 10-year-old Michael is shown killing animals, suffering emotional abuse at home. Blah, 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 blah.
It's almost
No,
comic
I'm not
booky,
done.
isn't
Hold
it?
on,
Like,
sorry. There's one more. I got you. Dave. Which is the Blumhouse timeline. Michael's appearance in the 2018 film Halloween, especially as the Blumhouse timeline. The version is a direct sequel to the original film, in which Michael and Laurie are not siblings. And it's established that after being shot by Loomis, Michael fled to his childhood home and was arrested by the police. And there we go. Madness.
Right.
Absolute insanity. Because fuck you, you'll buy it. And boy, have they.
Boy, have they bought it.
They've bought it. So there we go. It's scary. It's Halloween. We are getting ready to put on our costumes, and clearly, Dave, I think you're going to be dressing up and murdering a bunch of teenagers, which is, I think, you do half of those things all the time anyway. So is it much different for you, just dressing up and doing that, or?
Well, dressing up as a horror character is a bit different, Sam. You know.
All right, you're being whimsical when you murder all the teenagers, as you usually do in your Yorkshire village. Is that right?
Well, yeah, it's quite noticeable, Sam, when you're walking around in a costume like that. You can only really get away with it this time of year. Otherwise, the rest of the time you have to be dressed pretty incognito. Clipboards are good. Clipboards, lanyards. Anyone, if you've got a lanyard on, you can go anywhere you like. Serial killers really need to pick up on that, Sam. Get a clipboard and a lanyard and maybe a high vis. You can walk into the Houses of Parliament and murder the entire fucking government. That'd be fine. No one would question you.
There we go. Well, listener, if you don't hear from me again, you'll know why. And hopefully we'll be back next Halloween for another scary movie.
Shoot Nightmare on Elm Street next week, next month, next year.
Let's do it.